So I'm going to not spend a lot of time here talking about Islam because you have already done some investigation into it. You've watched a couple of videos. You've read through the chapter on Islam. So I'm going to hit some of the high points and give you an opportunity to ask questions or to contribute if you have anything that you think would be important for us to discuss. But anyway, I'm just going to hit some of those main ideas here. So we look at Islam at the same time that we have the growth of the Christian church in the Byzantine/Roman Empire. We also have the beginning here of Islam through Muhammad. We know that he's the prophet of Allah, and it is important that you remember that Muhammad was the last and the greatest prophet of Allah. And we talked about one day earlier last week that we said Allah means God. And so many of the Muslims, especially the early on Muslims, would have acknowledged that they believe in God. And they believe in one God. Very similar to the way many Christians believe. And so it started to cause some controversy because Christians and Muslims start talking and they say, well, do you believe in God? Yes, I do. But their belief system was very, very different. And that's part of the reason why when the Muslims begin to creep in on Jerusalem, that now those that hold to Christianity would be very upset that the Muslims are influencing many of the Christians in the eastern part of the Byzantine Empire. So we get here to Muhammad. He's the prophet, the last and greatest prophet of Allah, and his teachings become the basis for Islam. Islam, in and of itself, that term means submission. And when we think about our own belief system as Christians, and we think whatever you have in your mind as far as what is the basis for my belief, if I had to write a mission statement for what's my belief all about, I think some of us have a hard time including the word submission in that because we don't submit very well. We don't submit very well to the Bible's teachings. We don't submit very well to authority. And you add on top of the fact that we're Americans, and many Americans struggle with this idea of submission. And I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. And I'm not saying that this is the way it ought to be. I'm just saying that this is kind of the way it is. It's one of the weaknesses that many of us struggle with. When you look at Islam, their teachings are all about submission. And that is a key component to the way that they live and the way that they exercise their faith. And so the people who believe in Islam are called Muslims. And that word Muslim means a submitter to Allah, or someone who submits to Allah. And there are times where when I study through this section and when we talk about the Islam faith, there are times where I'm humbled and a little bit embarrassed about the commitment that I have. Just when you compare it a little bit here to the commitment they have to their belief system. Now, I think they're very wrong, but I also think they're very committed. And so anyway, the Muslims here are the believers. And so Muhammad, where was he born? Mecca, yeah. So he's born in Mecca, and he believed himself to be the final messenger of God. And this was something that was not widely accepted. Not a lot of people thought this was real. So in his hometown, he goes around and starts telling people, yeah, God gave me a vision. No, he didn't. Yeah, I'm pretty sure God spoke to me. I'm like the last and greatest prophet of Allah, so I think I'd know. No, we know you. You were eating dirt like when you're 4 years old and we watched you grow up, so no. And that's the difficulty that he had spreading his message in his hometown. And so he moved. He left. Anybody know where he went? No, he was in Mecca. That was where he was born. Where did he leave? Go to? I was thinking Medina.
Yes, Medina.
Yeah.
Not Medina.
Medina. Yeah. So he finds he finds a place that accepts his message in Medina. And this is where his followers begin to grow. It's almost as if he had to leave home, gain some credibility, and then come back. So I can tell you from personal example, my wife and I had to experience this. So we grew up in the same hometown, and we went through high school together, and we went through college together, and we were in the same church. Everybody knew us. When we got married, we felt like we were never viewed as adults or as like other married couples, that everybody looked at us, yeah, you guys are still like the high schoolers. And so we moved away, and we didn't necessarily have in our minds, we're going to move hundreds of miles away. But we moved away. We moved to Atlanta. And so after that move away, and then we come back, and every time we go back to visit our family, we show up in church, people do treat us differently. They look at us more like we're a little more grown up. Obviously now we're way more grown up because we have 3 kids. But, and so, we have, the view is a little bit different. And it's kind of like Muhammad had to go through that same idea here. And so he begins his journey here in Medina in 622. They were being persecuted, and so they leave his hometown and they go to Medina. And they accept him. We talked about this already, so I'm going to keep moving here. In 630, so it took 8 years for him to come back to his hometown, and this time they embrace him. And they're welcoming him in, and now they're ready to accept his teachings, and they think, okay, yeah, I think you really are the right guy. But it wasn't necessarily all peaceful. So he comes back almost in a militaristic way, where he comes back and says, I have a whole army of people that are willing to fight you if you don't want to believe. A little bit, yeah. Yeah. And so he has conversion by the sword in his return to Mecca. But most people fall in line, and most people are willing to accept them. And many of his followers continue his conquest as they go out and they spread his message. They're going to do it by the edge of the sword. So they're going to tell people, yeah, would you like to believe in Allah? Would you like to believe in the Muslim faith? Right. Yeah. But again, before we start pointing fingers and judging, Christians are going to do the exact same thing. So we'll get to that later. Yep. Yep. I could go back one more. Are you there? Let's see if I can pull it up here for you real quick. Yeah, it's in that vicinity. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly where it's at, but it's in that neighborhood. Mm-hmm. We good now? Yeah. Good? Okay. Let's talk about their teaching just for a moment. Their main book. Yeah, the A kind of makes that look a little funny, doesn't it? So their main beliefs come out of the Quran. I know there are 2 different spellings. You can choose either one. It'd be fine if you want to use the Q, if that's your preference. I like the K. But this is their sacred book of Islam. So that it's divided up into 114 chapters, and they're known as surahs. So when this book is put together, there are 4 different men that are put in charge of writing it, and they write it after Muhammad's dead. It's not written as he is living, like some of the New Testament was written, many of the Gospels were written during the life of Christ. Most is written post Muhammad's death. And these 4 guys, they sit down and they start writing it, and they find out that their writings are all different. Well, that's problematic if you have 4 different writings on Muhammad. And so they decide to take the best of the 4 and they burn the other 3. which ends up giving us the 114 chapters or surahs of the Quran. And so all of these are based off of Muhammad's teachings. Again, it is men's recollection of what they think he said or might have said, or what they remember him saying. However, I will say, in defense of the Quran, there are a number of positive things that it tries to teach. It teaches things like humility and kindness and responsibility, benevolence, caring about other people. Those are all good qualities and good things that they're trying to teach children, and even adults. They need that message too. So I will say that there's a lot of good things being taught in there. It's just often leading people in the wrong direction, by which those things are going to get us to. On the flip side, it also condemns things that we would condemn as well. Things like idolatry, murder, gambling, drinking, drunkenness, adultery, those type of things, the Quran is not going to support. And so that's part of the reason why many Christians and Muslims, they tend to get along when it comes to lifestyle, but ultimately belief system is much different. But they live very similar lifestyle in that regard. So there's a lot of biblical truth in there. Unfortunately, much of it is distorted. Parts of the scripture are used, but are twisted or are left out, or they've added to it. And I just want to remind you what Revelation says about adding to the scriptures. And the Bible talks about how that person is going to receive some pretty severe consequence and punishment. And so we want to be careful about any of that. There are 5 pillars, and I believe you wrote about this in one of your homework assignments, but it's important that we do know these 5, and so I'm going to put them all up here on the screen. Again, you can download these slides, pull these off of Canvas if I'm going too fast for you. I put on top of each one of those pillars the main idea, the main thing to help you remember what they're all about, and then these are the explanations for each of the 5. So you have to believe there's no God but Allah, and Muhammad's his prophet. You're going to pray 5 times a day. You're going to face toward Mecca when you're doing that. I'm not going to ask for a raise of hands, but how many of you take time to pray multiple times a day? Not that there's anything spiritual in praying a certain number of times, but we know that Daniel prayed 3 times. He's very faithful in that. Muslims are praying 5 times a day. Not that you can't accomplish a lot in one prayer a day, but communication with God is really important. Gavin?
Like the number 5 have significance?
I don't know. That's a good question. I've never really dug into that to find out why they picked 5. I don't know. So then you have to give money to the poor. That is the alms that I think our Islam group talked about. You have to fast during the month of Ramadan, sunrise to sunset, and then you need to make at least one pilgrimage to Mecca at some point in your lifetime. And when people go to Mecca, it is this huge gathering of all these different believers, and so it's pretty amazing. Yes?
I just looked it up. It says it's the number of balance.
Number of balance. Okay. Good to know.
When it symbolizes man, health, and love.
Interesting. What happens if you don't go? So it's, to my knowledge, and I could be wrong on this, but to my knowledge, it's not a requirement for them as far as if you don't do it, you're kicked out. But it's, yeah, so there are exceptions where you may not be able to get there, you may not be able to go, but otherwise, it's the expectation that at some point in your life you're going to make it there.